Good morning, everybody. I'm Gigi Sohn. I'm the President of Public Knowledge, and welcome to our conference where we're going to examine some interesting proposals for freeing up federal spectrum. You know, everybody has been talking for the past 10 months or so about the looming spectrum crisis. There's a lot of talk about freeing up 500 megahertz of spectrum so we can increase our broadband capacity, and there's talk about trying to get the broadcasters to voluntarily give up their spectrum, but there really isn't a lot of discussion about federal spectrum, so the spectrum that's under the control of the government. And while most people know that the Department of Defense and the Federal Aviation Administration and public safety entities control spectrum, I think people don't know that entities like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Department of Agriculture and the Smithsonian also control spectrum. Did you know? Not even the man who is in charge knew that. So, you know, the conversation always seems to lead to what Harold calls a log jam, right? So you have, you know, carriers who want to, you know, clear an auction. There are unlicensed proponents who want more unlicensed, and then there are federal spectrum managers who just want to hold on to what they have. So it's turned into kind of an intractable situation, and I think that's one of the reasons why federal spectrum is not often in the discussion of the looming spectrum crisis. So we're here to change that, and my colleague, Public Knowledge Legal Director Harold Fell, is here with his friend and colleague Greg Rose to propose two, I think, very, very interesting and I would say out-of-the-box proposals for freeing up federal spectrum for both licensed and unlicensed uses, while also allowing federal spectrum managers to feel good about giving up a little control. So they don't have to give up all control, but some control. So they're going to present two papers today. The first paper is going to be about federal secondary markets. So how can you have dynamic sharing of federal spectrum? The second paper is going to be about how the government can increase efficiency, spectrum efficiency, and transparency and innovation in spectrum use. And again, the idea is to break the log jam, get the spectrum managers, the federal government to feel comfortable about sharing, about leasing, and to kind of, you know, break the notion that things either have to be cleared in auction or simply used for unlicensed uses like Wi-Fi. So I think it's going to be a great day, or a great half day, and before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to thank my staff. First and foremost, Harold Feld, who really put this together and wrote these two white papers, which I think you'll find extremely engaging and interesting. Also, Whitney Tompkins, my administrative assistant and my executive assistant, and also who is the events manager of Public Knowledge, and Tim Ingerick, who is Public Knowledge's administrative assistant. You may have noticed Public Knowledge staff is growing. We just added our first government affairs director yesterday. His name is Ernesto Falcone. He comes from Bart Stupak's office. I don't think he's here today, but if folks have a chance to ping him, that would be great. It's Falcone at publicknowledge.org. He's going to be very, 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 very busy this summer, I can assure you. If people want to tweet this, and I hope you will, the hashtag is PKSRC. And the papers, I think only the first paper is on people's chairs, but the papers are on our website, and I think the second paper is also out front if you want to get them. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, Larry Strickling, who is not only one of the smartest people in government, he's also one of the nicest. So he proves that you can be both smart and hardworking and nice and work in government. And he is the Assistant Secretary for Communications and Information and the Administrator of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And as I said before, he the man when it comes to the management of federal spectrum. So he is the guy that holds the keys to how federal spectrum is going to be used in this country. So we're really, really looking forward to hear his remarks. So as most of you probably know, Larry has a broad range of both private and public sector experience. He was the Common Carrier Bureau Chief at the FCC. He was the policy coordinator for Obama for America. He was in charge of all if anybody was involved in the campaign, all the policy groups, of which there were many, and he and I worked closely together there. Again, he worked in the private sector for Ameritech, Allegiance Telecom, Broadwing, you name it, he's been there. But the most interesting thing that I see from Larry's resume is that he is on the board of directors of Music of the Baroque in Chicago. So you'll have to go to lunch sometime and have to tell me all about the music of the Baroque. But without further ado, I want to welcome Larry Strickling.
Thank you, Gigi. Actually, on the music of the Baroque, one of the things that happens when you join the Obama administration is you have to resign from every board you're on, including not-for-profits like that. So music of the Baroque is now a distant memory. But anyway, I do want to thank Gigi for the introduction, and I want to congratulate her and Harold and Public Knowledge for organizing today's conference. The management of federal spectrum is an important issue, and we at NTIA welcome the engagement of Public Knowledge and all of you today to come together and discuss the ways to maximize the efficient use of spectrum by federal users. At the outset, I'd like to agree wholeheartedly with the point Harold makes in one of his papers up for discussion today, and that is that there is value to increasing the transparency and public engagement in federal spectrum policy. And today, in addition to my appearance here, I'm pleased that our two most senior spectrum officials at NTIA, Carl Nebbia and Eddie Davison, are here as well and will be speaking on the two panels later this morning. And I hope that our participation here demonstrates our commitment to working with the public on these issues. So I guess my task here is to set the table for the panel discussions to follow. Otherwise, I did read Harold's papers that I got like last night at 9 o'clock p.m. And I am prepared to go ahead and answer them fully, but I figured you wouldn't need the conference after that. So I'll just keep my powder dry for the most part, and we'll allow the panel discussions to go on as planned. And again, you'll have Carl and Eddie both to provide much more expert reactions to these ideas than I could provide you today. So I think I'll spend my time giving you my perspective on the current processes that we use at NTIA to administer the federal use of spectrum. And I think, as many of you know, we are the principal advisor to the President on Communications and Information Policy. Since I came on board just about a year ago, most of the attention directed at our agency has been related to the Recovery Act broadband grants and also with some developments in internet governance. But NTIA has always had federal spectrum as a core mission, and obviously it's more important now than ever before. I don't need to tell this audience that in the United States and around the world we're seeing a virtual explosion of uses for wireless technologies. Mobile broadband use in particular has experienced growth in the United States that was unimaginable only a few years ago. And broadband, particularly expanding the access to broadband internet, is a key element of the President's strategy to create durable and sustainable economic growth. As mobile broadband use spreads and the number of applications explodes, it requires more and more radio spectrum. You all are quite knowledgeable and I'm sure know the statistics, but let me review some of them for you. The number of active mobile internet users has doubled in the past 2 years to over 40 million users. The growth rate for the adoption of mobile broadband is greater than the growth rate for DSL and cable modem services combined. Downloading videos, participating in video conferences, using interactive internet applications utilize much more bandwidth than mobile voice calls, and we can expect that the projected volumes of mobile data traffic will grow exponentially in the future. In addition, we expect a huge increase in machine-based wireless communications over the next several years as smart devices take advantage of the ubiquitous connectivity afforded by high-speed wireless data networks. By 2014, Cisco projects wireless networks in North America will carry some 740 petabytes per month, a greater than 40-fold increase over last year. So, given this growing and apparently insatiable demand, Finding new spectrum for mobile broadband has become a key priority for policymakers. The Federal Communications National Broadband Plan observes that the growth of wireless broadband will be constrained if government does not make spectrum available to enable network expansion and technology upgrades. This will require the reallocation of spectrum from both commercial and federal users, and it will likely involve both the relocation of current uses as well as geographic and dynamic sharing. The FCC's National Broadband Plan makes several recommendations about how to meet the demand for broadband spectrum that the Obama administration, including NTIA and Congress, are now reviewing. Overall, the National Broadband Plan calls for 500 megahertz of spectrum to be made available over the next 10 years. Traditionally, these calls for more commercial spectrum have led to federal agencies being required to relocate operations to free up spectrum for the exclusive use of commercial users. But today, it's just not as simple as it might have been. So let me give you some background on our current federal spectrum management practices, hopefully to provide you some context for how we will approach this current need to identify and allocate spectrum for mobile broadband use. First, you may be surprised to learn that in the space between 300 megahertz and 3.5 gigahertz, only 17% of that spectrum is used exclusively by federal entities. 32% is used exclusively by non-federal users, and the majority, some 51%, is shared today by federal and non-federal users. And some of you may be wondering, how does this sharing take place between federal and non-federal users? Well, sometimes we share spectrum to accommodate the same type of operations. So, for example, radar altimeters in airplanes are required of government and civilian aircraft, but they operate in one shared band, 4,200 to 4,400 megahertz. In other cases, federal government provides a service to both federal and non-federal users. So, air traffic communications originate with the FAA, but federal and non-federal aircraft respond in that shared band. Weather satellites, that we're going to talk about a little later, are controlled by NOAA, but hundreds of public safety agencies, TV and radio stations, research institutions across the country operate their own dishes to receive weather data direct from these satellites. The other fact I hope that everyone understands is that federal agencies do not receive licenses to use spectrum the same way commercial entities do. NTIA provides assignments of spectrum to federal agencies upon their request, but that assignment does not bestow any property rights on the agencies and the spectrum we assign them. So this approach allows us to assign the same frequency to different agencies for different uses in different parts of the country. So when a federal agency requests an assignment, every other affected federal agency is given an opportunity to determine whether the proposed use is likely to interfere with the existing uses. Yet, even with this type of review that's conducted, we are able to complete our assignments within 9 days, and of course, much sooner in the case of an emergency. So this process is well understood within the federal agencies, but we're certainly aware of the public's interest in understanding these practices better. Congress, as I assume most, if not all of you know, is considering legislation to require a full spectrum inventory by both NTIA and the FCC of both the federal uses and the non-federal uses. Legislation passed by the House earlier this year would provide greater transparency into who is using both commercial and government spectrum and for what purpose. The House bill specifically directs that the inventory be used to identify underutilized spectrum and to recommend possible reallocations. In the Obama administration, we support the concept of a spectrum inventory, and in fact, we are already taking steps to make information on current spectrum use more accessible to the public. I do have two cautions, however. First, federal spectrum is used to support sensitive national security and law enforcement applications that must be protected and preserved. As we work to increase transparency around federal spectrum use, keep in mind that information regarding federal operations actually belongs to the agencies themselves, and they ultimately decide what is releasable consistent with national security requirements. Many of them are particularly concerned about the impact that releasing specific location and frequency information may have on vital communications. However, despite these constraints, we do believe that a lot can be explained about federal use that would facilitate a much broader understanding and would enhance policy and allocation discussions and decisions. Our Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, which we call CSMAC for short, whose members come from the business community, public interest groups, and other federal agencies, has recently completed a set of recommendations on this issue, and NTIA will be reviewing them to see how we might be able to move forward to make more information available to the public, even as we wait for the legislation from Congress. My second caution is about how the public will use this information, particularly as it relates to identifying possible spectrum for reallocation. We've all heard the statements that at any given point in time, much spectrum is not in use, and if we could just document that lack of use, we could make a lot of spectrum available for commercial use. This may be true up to a point, but the underlying assumption of these statements seems to be that unless a band is saturated with a lot of users the way land mobile radio is, the spectrum is a candidate for reallocation. It's an overly simplistic view of the world of federal spectrum. And what's missing from those arguments is any acknowledgement of the importance of the use of a given band, even if it is sporadic. So for example, law enforcement utilizes certain bands for the most sensitive of its covert surveillance operations. If we only look at the amount of use of those particular frequencies, we might conclude that that spectrum could be made available for commercial use. But the law enforcement imperative is to have this spectrum available when and where it is needed, and when it is being used, law enforcement has to know there will not be any interference from other uses that might imperil the operation or worse, the lives of the agents involved in surveillance. So when we do get involved in evaluating specific bands for reallocation, we're finding it's an increasingly complex process. Many federal systems, such as radar or satellite systems, have very unique capabilities that cannot be met by commercial services, easily replaced with off-the-shelf equipment, or even moved to other bands, except at extreme expense. So this means it's not possible to relocate these uses, or if we do, it will require many years and many dollars to do so. Even in bands that may appear to be relatively straightforward candidates for reallocation, the process may turn out to be quite involved. As many of you know, the FCC, largely at the request of industry, has suggested that NTIA evaluate the 1755 to 1780 band for possible pairing in an auction with the 20 megahertz of AWS-3 spectrum at 2155 to 2175. We've concluded from our preliminary review of that band that there are just too many agencies and too many assets involved there to allow for a pairing with AWS-3 in the time frame the FCC has set for the auction. However, as a possible alternative to match with AWS-3, we've started to take a look at the nearby 1675 to 1710 megahertz band. And let me describe for you the process we're using to evaluate that band. And I think you'll find it helpful for the discussions you're going to have later this morning. At first glance, this band looks pretty straightforward. There's one dominant user, NOAA. There are two dominant uses, radio sondes or weather balloons, and weather satellite downlinks. So these weather balloons, they get launched twice a day around the country and provide airborne measurement information. And the satellites are sending raw weather data initially to a relatively small number of NOAA users, and there's some other government agencies that have downlinks as well. So this at first glance appears to be a fairly underused band. However, these weather balloons remain aloft for up to a couple of hours, and they're drifting in the along with the wind currents. They reach high altitudes and continue to broadcast back to their base until they are just a distant speck on the horizon, and then they basically are disposable. Some of you may find them in your backyards from time to time. Meanwhile, weather centers receiving data from the satellites process that data, send it back to the satellites. Then from there, the information can be received by public safety institutions, research centers, TV stations. In fact, the information is available to anyone who puts a dish up in their backyard. No license is required, and in fact, no one knows how many people currently are receiving this weather information direct from satellites. So as we approach this band and look at it as a possible band to pair with AWS-3, a key assumption in our analysis has to be that the band we will not relocate any of these uses in this band. I mean, as a practical matter, we couldn't do so if we wanted, because you can't change the radio and the satellite once it's launched into space. So you either are making a decision not to use the satellite any longer, or you have to figure out a way to accommodate that use. So the question before us is really to determine whether mobile broadband can share this band with the NOAA operations. And so how do we go about answering that question? Well, first, we need to know the number of ground stations that NOAA operates in this band. Is that number appropriate, or could operations be consolidated into fewer ground stations? For those ground stations that must continue to operate, what's the radius of the protection zone that must be defined to prevent interference to the ground station operations? That can range anywhere from a few miles to, in some cases, 200 miles, depending on the characteristics of the potential interfering use. And so as we answer those and other questions, we can build a picture of where in the United States this spectrum could be made available for commercial mobile broadband use, carving out those areas that must be kept off limits to protect the necessary ground station operations. But even then, we're not done with our inquiry. I mentioned the hundreds of dishes out there that receive the weather data from these satellites. Those users would absolutely be affected by a reallocation. And for those users, we need to understand whether, even in our modern network world, it's possible to supply this weather data by different means than satellite downlinks in this particular band. Could we distribute the same information via the internet or over other satellite bands? And what would it cost to do so? To deal with these issues, we will have to work with the FCC, which will need to initiate a proceeding to understand who's in this band and what the alternatives might be to the satellite downlinks people are using today. So I hope you can see how quickly the questions pile up and how complicated the processes necessarily have to be to do these sorts of evaluations. And I want to emphasize that while this band might appear to offer some possibilities, we're still in the information gathering stage, and it's way premature to be making any predictions as to whether in fact this band could be reallocated to allow commercial uses. Now, as we perform an overall assessment of all federal uses, which would be contemplated by the inventory legislation, we do have to consider the possible relocation of federal agency uses. Where relocation of federal agency uses is required, we've been working to improve the process for the affected agencies. Many of you will recall that in the last major spectrum auction, Congress enacted legislation that created a fund to cover the expenses of federal agencies required to relocate to other bands. This process worked reasonably well, but we've heard from the federal agencies and from industry that the process could be improved for future relocations. A major concern is the need for startup funds to ensure that the relocation process goes smoothly. Under the original law, funds did not become available until after the auction had taken place. But what the agencies tell us is that it would be far better to provide funds up front, prior to the auction. This provides for a smoother, a swifter, and more predictable transition and more efficient use of the spectrum, helping not only the incumbent federal agency that is forced to move, but also the commercial auction winner as well. And so we should definitely consider making these planning and research funds available early in the relocation process prior to the auction, not after the auction takes place. We're also hearing from the agencies that they need to have an adequate time for relocation. And that needs to be determined by a realistic, fact-specific assessment rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. The agencies are clearly interested in incentives that will encourage them to vacate spectrum expeditiously, such as allowing improved capabilities or taking advantage of non-spectrum-based solutions or commercial services in appropriate circumstances. Under the last auction, the rules as set by the Office of Management and Budget dictated that an agency relocating into another band could only relocate using the same technology it was using in the band it was moving from. You can see how that doesn't provide a real incentive for an agency to move when it's missing the opportunity to perhaps upgrade to digital technology, from which we all benefit from a more efficient use of the new spectrum that the agency is moving to. So again, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. Overall, we've heard these concerns from the agencies and from industry, and we are working with Congress who is considering some relocation legislation this term to make these improvements to the relocation process. Relying solely on relocation of existing federal users, however, is not going to meet the burgeoning demand for spectrum for broadband, particularly this 10-year goal set out by the FCC of 500 megahertz. Sharing arrangements and new technical solutions are needed so that we can stretch our finite spectrum resources. As I mentioned before, there are plenty of studies that show spectrum is not used continuously all the time or across all geographic locations. So finding the technical and regulatory mechanisms to utilize the open spaces in these bands is a very promising area of innovation. These opportunities can be exploited through rules that create fixed geographic or frequency separations, but we also know that dynamic sharing solutions might go much further to create even more sharing opportunities. So in order to explore possible dynamic spectrum access solutions, NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management, working with our spectrum measurement team at the Boulder Labs, the Institute for Telecommunications Sciences, have launched a spectrum sharing innovation testbed. Using this testbed, we're evaluating the ability of geolocation and sensing devices to permit sharing of land mobile radio spectrum. NTIA is working to move this research forward by demonstrating what spectrum access technology can and cannot do today, both in the lab and in the real world. And the testbed is proving to be an important opportunity for federal agencies to work cooperatively with industry, researchers, and academia to evaluate these new technologies for both sensing and geolocation. In fact, in July, ITS is holding a conference on spectrum sharing. I think it's the last week of July, and I encourage everyone today interested in that topic to attend those important meetings out in Colorado. In addition to possible technological advancements, some have suggested that the use of market mechanisms may be the best way to ensure that spectrum currently in the hands of federal agencies is put to its highest and best use. However, we find that government requirements do not easily adapt to a direct market competition with commercial interests. Leasing spectrum held by government agencies on a secondary market basis is certainly theoretically possible, but it runs into issues that make it impractical to apply. The first being what I mentioned earlier, that the agencies don't really receive assignments and any property rights in them that'll really allow them to make them available to other folks. I did have a chance, as I mentioned, to review Harold's paper last night that raises a really intriguing idea for creating a secondary market in bands allocated for federal use that I think gets past this problem of dealing with a particular agency's assignment. It's a very complicated proposal, and I know there will be a lot of discussion of it today. My first reaction to it, reading it, given all of the financial constraints that we are under in the federal government, is to ask whether or not these ideas could be implemented first in the commercial world. It seemed that the ideas are very interesting and could be just as easily applied in the commercial world as it could to the government world. And certainly a proof of concept by industry would go a long ways toward creating the momentum that might be required to find the necessary resources to do this in the federal government. But in any event, I hope the discussion today provides a thorough examination of Harold's ideas. We at NTIA look forward to being a part of these technical and policy solutions to enable us to be as efficient as possible in the use of spectrum. We are open to new ideas, and we believe that government, the public, service providers, and equipment developers will need to work together to forge solutions, all for the national good. In closing, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. As you can tell, we have significant challenges ahead of us, in order to meet the expected spectrum demand created by mobile broadband devices and other applications. And the Obama administration is acting to meet these challenges, and we look forward to working with you in the years ahead. So thank you very much.
So we have time for...
Three.
Time for one or two.
And if they're hard, I reserve the right to give them to Carl or Eddie.
So raise your hand and Michael will... For future panels, though, we'd like you to use the index cards, but for this one, we'll just...
Larry McMiller, based on your conversation, on your talk just now, do you think the broadband plan is prospective total spectrum transfer is realistic?
The 500 megahertz? We are still looking at that. I think what I can tell you is that it's not going to be accomplished by clearing bands and reallocating them for exclusive use of other providers. That, I think, is a given. We will have to accomplish that goal, assuming the Obama administration adopts that goal, and it hasn't just yet, with understanding and being able to implement some of these sharing ideas over that 10-year period.
Jerry Edwards.
Larry, how long do you think NTIA's next phase of study regarding AWS-3 that you just described may take to reach a conclusion?
We're hoping to be able to reach some preliminary conclusions this fall. On the issue of finding a band of pair, yeah, and I think that's consistent with what the FCC suggested, because I think if we can't reach a conclusion that quickly, I think based on what they say in the plan, they want to move forward and go ahead and auction AWS-3 on pair.
Will you commit to making your Spectrum Management Advisory Committee more transparent? For example, minutes have not been posted to a large extent over the last year. The video transcripts in the last 3 meetings, there's a link there. The first one doesn't work. The other 2, there's no video. The transcripts, the spelling is great. The grammar is pretty good. The content is really awful in terms of the accuracy of the transcripts. For the last meeting, the Federal Register said the meeting started at 9:30. The actual notice that went up within 24 hours had it started at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Jim, introduce yourself and let...
So why not make it transparent? Why not provide email notification to meetings like for 6 months? Almost every month, please be notified of the next meeting. And they simply, your office simply won't do it. They say, go look at the Federal Register.
Well, I'll take all that back, but I think what you're suggesting is we have some bad execution of our efforts to be transparent, not a refusal to be transparent. So we'll go back and see why it is that the videos aren't posted and all that. But the fact is, as you know, as you attend these meetings, they are streamed, the videos are made available. I think there's no issue about the fact that anybody can see exactly what the group is doing. But I'll take your specific concerns back. Now, I don't know if we want to, that shouldn't be the last question.
Yes, absolutely. Paul Kirby will have the last one.
Well, maybe that should have been the last
Paul Kirby with TR Daily. Regarding the timing of the analysis of the second band, you mentioned the 1755 to 80, the preliminary analysis being that would be good for pairing, and the National Broadband Plan says for conclusion by October 1. Would you also look for October 1 specifically for this other spectrum you're looking at that involves weather balloons and weather satellites, or not necessarily?
If we could do it by then, great. I guess I'm telling you we expect to be done this fall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, we're going to go straight into our first panel, Breaking the Logjam, Creating Sustainable Spectrum Access to the Federal Secondary Market. So the panelists